Okay, good evening from New York and good morning in Indonesia, my friends. Well, this is our 188th issue of Theovlogy, and I am joined here by two fellows from Jakarta, Indonesia, Sheila Mawene and also Timotheus Ferdino. Sheila is a graduate student at Jakarta Theological Seminary in Jakarta, and Timo is a graduate student at the Faculty of Theology at Duta Wacana Christian University in Yogyakarta. Well, we are profoundly pleased that a distinguished scholar would join us at this session. Our topic today is what is mysticism? But let me first introduce our guest to you all. Bernard McGinn is the Naomi Shenstone Donnelley Professor Emeritus at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Professor McGinn taught there for 34 years, and I have the privilege to study with some of his former students at Seattle University and now at Fordham University in New York City. The author and editor of many books, his most noted publications on mysticism are the 6-volume History of Western Christian Mysticism under the title The Presence of God. He also serves as the chief editor-in-chief of the Classics of Western Spirituality, published by Paulist Press. Professor McGinn is a fellow of the Medieval Academy of America and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has served as president of the American Society of Church History and of the American Catholic Historical Association. Professor McGinn, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I would like to give you the time for you to lead what is mysticism.
Well, thank you so much for organizing this and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this on what's really a worldwide level. I mean, that's what's so fascinating about what's happening to us, closed in as we are by the COVID virus. Nevertheless, we can talk to people around the world. And I have a general talk here, obviously, under the title, What is Mysticism? And I hope to provoke some thoughts and some questions from you and to engage in conversation. So I'll speak for about 35 minutes or so. Is that about right? I don't want to overdo this, but I'll try to give you a general sense. This is not the first time I've given this talk. I've given this talk in various ways. It's not a written out talk. It's just a series of notes. But I've given it in too many audiences in many different venues. And I find it useful for provoking, as I said, people to think about mysticism. And so I'll start with that question. I mean, when you hear the word mysticism, what do you think of? You know, what do you think of? You know, take just a minute or two and think about what does mysticism mean to you? Well, you know, mysticism is a word that's very easily misunderstood. For lots of people, it means something that's bizarre, uncanny, weird, magical, irrational. It's something, you know, very, very, very strange and very, very different. For others, believing Christians, they know mysticism is a part of the Christian faith tradition, as it is in other traditions, but they think of it as the realm of what I call the unusual, the paranormal, you know, psychosomatic experiences that are very strange. People have visions, or people who see the wounds of Jesus, the stigmata, people who levitate, fly up in the air, people who don't eat for years in India, severe kinds of asceticism. In other words, it's still very strange and unusual. For other people, again, I'm speaking mostly about Christian mysticism. You know, mysticism is a very elite phenomenon. It's a very special relationship to God, but it's only for very few privileged people that are given very special graces. So it has nothing to do with real life. I mean, it's something that you can admire from a distance, but it doesn't belong to your own life as a believer. My point, and the point of most of my writing over many, many years now, 50 years or so, is that all those are misunderstandings of mysticism. That mysticism to believing Christians and people in other religious traditions as well is an intimate part, an integral and necessary part of their belief structure. It's not the unusual. It's not the out of the ordinary. Mysticism is something that relates to them. Maybe not the highest realms of mystical experience or mystical consciousness, but it's not something that's just for, just for other people. And I'd like to quote three famous Catholic authors from the 20th century who I think tried to express that in their own ways very succinctly. A great French scholar named Henri Bremont wrote an 11-volume history of religious sensibility in France in the 17th century and on. And it's basically a history of mysticism. In the second volume, he says, in very interesting phrase, it is not possible to ignore the mystical, to ignore the mystics without disowning the self. Not possible to ignore the mystics without disowning the self. Even if you're not a mystic or don't think of yourself as a mystic, which was true of Bremont, said you have to pay attention to them. Pay attention to the mystics because they tell you something about the possibilities of human nature. This is something that's integral in all human beings. Second person I would quote is the great Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who died in 1984. In one of the essays in his Theological Investigations, he says, the Christian of the future will either be a mystic or will not be a Christian at all. The Christian of the future will either be a mystic or will not be a Christian at all. For Rahner, in the context of the problematic world, the modern world, 20th, 21st century, mysticism was essential to Christianity. The third person I'll quote just briefly, it's another great Jesuit, the great scientist, thinker, mystic, Teilhard de Chardin. In one of his letters to his friend, Abbé Bruel, again I quote, mysticism remains the great science and the great art, the only power capable of synthesizing the riches accumulated by the other forms of human activity. Now, if you think about it, that's a remarkable claim. It's saying that mysticism is kind of the height of the human accomplishment because it can synthesize and put together the other aspects of human nature. So that's an argument for the point that I'm making about why is mysticism necessary. Certainly great thinkers have thought so, and I think it's increasingly more obvious today that many people also think the same. But what is mysticism, this necessary aspect? And here I'll just make a few reflections, and then I want to talk more about what mysticism is, in my view. Well, we can start out with a very generic, general interpretation of mysticism. I would say the easy definition of mysticism is a deeper sense of God's transforming presence in our lives. Deeper sense of God's transforming presence in our lives, our daily lives. But the mystical element, as I call it, is not the whole of religion. It's an element in religion that coexists with many other aspects of religion, both in Christianity, but also in other related traditions, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, etc. Mysticism is an element that coexists with institutional religion, and all religions have some kind of institution. Mysticism is also an element that coexists with what we can call the intellectual aspect of religion, the way in which we think carefully and try to make sense of what we believe, so that it's not the whole of religion. It's an aspect that interacts with the other different aspects of different religion. Now, living this mystical element, thirdly, is not just, I think, a matter of performing certain kinds of religious activities, praying, engaging in ascetical practices, deep meditation, etc. These are an important part of what mysticism means, but they are just certain religious practices that aid to it. They're necessary, but mysticism is wider than that. It's a life-transforming activity that engages all aspects of the human person. Prayer, meditation, liturgical exercise, etc. These are all a part of mystical practice. But mysticism is not, I engage in these activities, I do this, I do that, I do the other thing. Mysticism is a transforming way of looking at your whole religious life. That's very important because it shows you the kind of integrated aspect of mysticism. Fourthly, lots of people think of mysticism as very individualistic. I have an experience of God. He's up there. It's very private. It's God and me. He's really being nice to me, and I'm trying to pray to him, etc. But if you read the great mystics, both of all the traditions that I know, especially Jewish and Islamic a little bit, as well as Christianity, mysticism is personal. It does happen to you as an individual, but it's not individualistic. It's not selfish. It's not solipsistic. It doesn't cut you off from your tradition and make you a little special person here somewhere on the side. That mysticism puts you in contact with other people because you have certain obligations through what experience you might have of God to be a part of a tradition and to help other people. So increasing love of God and love of neighbor is an integral part of mysticism. It's not a private religious thing for me alone. It's something that God gives me to be shared. It's a part of my belonging to a Christian community. So mystical element, as I'm talking about it, is always a part of the life of the church. It takes place in the ecclesial community. It takes place through activities, common activities, worships, and sacraments. So it's a deep level of what in Roman Catholicism we can speak of as ecclesiological existence. And living this mystical or contemplative life is where we find God and where we find our true selves, where we learn to detach from the false self, try to live the true self, and relate that true self to other people. And this is why I insist that it's really made for all Christians. It's not just something given to the few. And here I'd like to just cite a few authorities again. These are some of the great mystics in the Christian tradition, and the greatest mystics always said that mysticism was meant for all. Not that all would realize it or attain it on the same level, but let me just cite. I'll just cite three authorities here. Gregory the Great in the 6th century was one of the wonderful Christian mystics, the first medieval pope, you could say. In one of his homilies, he's talking about contemplation, which is really just another word for mysticism. I'll get into that. And he says, and I'm quoting him here directly from his homilies on Ezekiel, the gift of contemplation is not given just to the highest group, that's the clergy, not just to the lowest group, but frequently to the highest, frequently to the least, more frequently to those set apart. Those are the monks, that's the Romoti in Latin. Sometimes also to the married. Therefore, there's no Christian state from which the grace of contemplation can be excluded. There is no Christian state from which the grace of contemplation can be excluded. Contemplation, by which he means mysticism, is meant for all Christians. Thomas Aquinas, in the late 13th century, in one of his writings, when he's setting up, responding to objections about different people. And here he's responding to objections about the relationship of the contemplative life and the active life. And this is what he says. He goes argument by argument. But to the fifth point, we say that not everyone in the active life will come to the perfect state of contemplation. Nevertheless, every Christian who is in a state of salvation must participate in some way in contemplation, since the precept is for all that the Psalm says, "Be still and see that I am the Lord." So Thomas says people realize contemplation on different levels, higher levels and lower levels. But every Christian who is in the state of salvation, called to be one with God, must participate in contemplation. And finally, the final authorities is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, published under Pope John Paul II, 1994. And one of its articles, very, very late in the large catechism, it puts this, I think, very succinctly and clearly. This is what the Catechism says. Spiritual progress tends toward ever mature union with God. This union is called mystical because it participates in the mystery of God through the sacraments, the holy mysteries, and in him in the mystery of the Holy Trinity. God calls us all to this intimate union with him, even if the special graces or ordinary signs of this mystical life are granted only to some for the sake of manifesting the gratuitous gift to all. So everybody's called to this. Some people get special graces, but that's just as a kind of example, if you will, or encouragement to the others. So my first point is that mysticism is meant for all Christians. But what is mysticism? Let me say a little bit about the nature of mysticism, as I not define it, but maybe describe it, and a little bit about the history of the word. And while mysticism as a noun is a modern word, it's probably created in the 17th century, first in French, la mystique, and then it comes over into English usage towards the end of the 17th century. So it's not an ancient word, and so some people say, well, maybe we shouldn't talk about mysticism, in the ancient church, the patristic period, and the medieval period. Maybe that's an anachronism. I don't think so. The mysticism as a qualifier. What is mystical? Mystikos in Greek, mysticus in Latin. That adjective or adverb is a very ancient word in Christianity. Goes back to the 2nd century of the Christian era, and it's used to describe what I call the depth dimension of Christian living. You can think of Christian living as having a surface dimension where is obvious and where we do certain practices, do certain things. Christian believes that underneath these things that you can physically observe, there's a deeper dimension, a spiritual dimension, or a mystical dimension. And that's what this word mystikos, which means hidden, secret, in ancient Greek, is taken over as a Christian word of great importance from the 2nd century. And it's used in many ways. The primary dimension is the mystical interpretation of Scripture. Scripture has a overt dimension, a surface dimension. You can read the words of the Bible, whether you believe in the Bible or not, kind of understand what they say. But the Christian believes the Bible has a deeper meaning, a spiritual meaning, pneumatikos, or a mystical dimension, mystikos, where you encounter God. That's the fundamental meaning, signifier of mystikos in ancient Christianity, down to the 12th century. Mystical means the hidden dimension of the Bible where you reach God on a personal kind of level. But it also is referred to mystical rituals. Baptism is mystical. The Eucharist is ritual. What do you see in baptism if you're a non-believer, if you're an ancient pagan looking at baptism? Well, somebody's pouring water on somebody else. Christian sees that, but sees the inner meaning of that. It's not just pouring water, it's rebirth in Christ. Or the pagan sees the Christian sharing a meal of bread and wine. Oh, they're having a meal of bread and wine. The Christian sees, oh, no, this is their communion with Christ. That's the mystical dimension of the ritual. And then the Christians talk about mystical contemplation. It's a contemplation which reaches God. And they even, after about the 4th century, talk about mystical union as being united with God in a secret way. Or by the year 500, a mysterious monk of Eastern Christianity talks about mystical theology. A very key term and a very key treatise in the history of Christian mysticism. But when you read the writings ascribed to Dionysius, the so-called pseudo-Dionysius, don't think of mystical theology as something you do in the classroom. That's not what he had in mind. Mystical theology is a way of life. It's a way of doing theology, the word about God, on a deeper level in the whole life of the community. As a matter of fact, the Dionysian treatises were not written for a classroom. They're written for a monastic community in order to teach the monks the meaning, the deeper meaning of the life that they were leading. So the word, goes deep into the Christian tradition in that sense. And the fact that it then became a noun, a substantive as mysticism, is just a kind of modern, I think, invention. So different uses of mystical occurred, but more often the people that we call mystics today were called contemplatives, contemplativi in the ancient tradition, because there's really very little difference between contemplation and mysticism. The two words are really interchangeable in much of the tradition. Someone like Thomas Merton, for example, who wrote so much about what we can say is mysticism, he really didn't use mysticism very often. He talked about contemplation because that was the more ancient word. And it's not until the 17th century, really, that the people who in earlier centuries were called contemplatives, contemplativi, come to be called mystici, mystics. Now, there are a number of related other Greek terms that relate also to this term mystikos, terms like mysterion, the mystery, which is so big in the Pauline works, or contemplation itself, theoria, contemplatio, which doesn't occur, in the Bible itself, either in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. But Christians could easily read it in. For example, with texts like Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. What else is it to see God than to contemplate God? Another key Greek term that comes in, that's not in the Christian Bible, is deification. Theosis in Greek, deificatio in Latin. They don't occur there, but they certainly are good interpretations of the basic intent of the Christian scriptures, which as early as Father Irenaeus in the 2nd century, as he put it, was the whole economy of the incarnation was God became man so that man could become God. Divinization. Theosis in the Greek term. So mysticism goes deeply back into the tradition, and although it's a modern word, it only becomes a kind of technical word in religious studies probably in the 19th century. I think it's still a legitimate word to express what mystikos and contemplativi meant for the earlier centuries. So what does it mean? And this will be the last part of what I'm going to be talking about. How do you define it? Well, maybe you can't define it. Take the word religion itself. You know, there are as many definitions of religion as there are people who study religion. Part of the interest in studying religion is to see the interplay between the different definitions of religion and try to say, well, which one brings out which kind of element. So mysticism is a little bit like religion. We all know it refers to a certain frame of reference about certain kinds of practices and beliefs, but people can and will disagree about what it means to them. I like to quote, I'll give another quotation here, famous English Anglican scholar Vidar Ing, in his book Christian Mysticism of 1899, has the following statement: "No word in our language, not even socialism, has been employed more loosely than mysticism." Or Louis Dupre, an old friend of mine, in the article on mysticism in the 1986 Encyclopedia of Religion, says, "No definition of mysticism could be both meaningful and sufficiently comprehensive to include all the experiences that at some time or another have been described as mystical." So it's a hard thing to define. In my different writings on mysticism, both in my long history and in my anthology, Essential Writings of Mysticism, I've worked out what I call a kind of heuristic description, might be better than definition, and this is it. Mysticism is that part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effect of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. Maybe I should read that one more time. It's a little long. Mysticism is that part or element of Christian belief and practice that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the effect of what the mystics themselves have described as a direct and transformative presence of God. Now, in the time that remains to me, let me just unpack that kind of description according to its different elements, its different terms. There are 5 or 6 of these that are important. First, mysticism is a part or element of religion. I made that point before. It's not the whole of religion. It coexists with institutional aspects, intellectual aspects, and various other aspects as well. The great scholar of mysticism, Friedrich von Hugel, early in the 20th century, wrote a book, The Mystical Element of Religion, first published in 1908, in which he laid that out, I think, in great detail, and said that if you think of mysticism as the whole of religion, you're going to misconstrue it. If you think of it as a part that interacts with other important dimensions, then you get a much better sense of mysticism. And if you think of the healthy interaction of institutional, intellectual, and mystical elements in religion, you're on your way to much more adequate definition of the nature of religion. And that's, I think, the great insight that we can still gain from Hugel's book. The second element is what I call process. That's what I mean by preparation, consciousness, and effect. Many philosophers who study mysticism study the moment of mystical union and what various mystics have said about the moment of mystical union, and they try to analyze it from different perspectives. I think that's a problem. I think that's a mistake. The mystical element is a process. It's part of a life story, the story of people, very great religious leaders, so that it's not just one moment, but it involves a journey through life, that it has preparation, that has various practices, that has an attainment of some deeper moments of consciousness of God, and that also has different kinds of effects of that. So we have to locate the mystical element back in the life of the mystics to separate it out, to talk about it in terms of, these moments of union that a few mystics have described, is to really misconstrue it, I think, very, 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 very severely. So preparation is important, but consciousness. The preparation is involved in gaining a deeper consciousness of God. Now, many students of mysticism study mystical experience, and many of the mystics talk about experience as well. I prefer the term consciousness, that not to rule out experience. Experience is a part of consciousness. But I prefer the term consciousness because it's much more holistic. Many people think of experience as having an experience of some particular kind of thing, perhaps a very unusual thing that has never occurred to you before, feeling some new kind of thing, experiencing some new kind of illumination or light. But consciousness is much broader than just experience. It includes experience along with thinking and intellectual activity, as well as activity of love, activity of decision, etc. And so, while I don't deny that experience is a part of mystical consciousness is a much wider and more holistic term than just experience. And I'm afraid that so many people, when I talk about mystical experience, think about, I felt something different than I've ever felt before. That's not mysticism. You may feel something different, but it's what it does to your whole conscious life. I also make the distinction here between what we can call experience of and experience in. Experience of something. I have experience of lifting up my watch here. I have experience of drinking a little bit of water for my throat. But for the mystics, it's more experience in. Experiencing. What does that mean? Well, suppose somebody is described as an experienced wine taster. Doesn't mean he just tastes wine all the time. His experience in tasting wine. He has learned a lot, and he can think about that, and he can convey it to other people. So if there is an experience, mystical experience is much more an experience in than it is an experience of. I've also described it, along with that term, consciousness, I could say a lot more about that, as a direct or immediate form of consciousness, because it involves something deeper than the ordinary realms of experience. Obviously, there's some experience we have of God or some consciousness of God in all religious practices that we are engaged in, liturgical or ascetical or communitarian or whatever they be. But the mystics insist that there's some kind of deeper level of consciousness of God that takes place in their lives, perhaps in religious activities like prayer, but perhaps just in their everyday lives. But it happens on a deeper level, a more immediate or a more direct level. That's a very important part of what they teach. There's a lot of philosophical and theological problems involved about, can there ever be in this life an immediate experience of God? Again, I'm not going to go into those here, but I use the term direct or immediate in order to point to that element in the witness of the mystics that say they find God in a somehow deeper way than they do in their ordinary forms of life. The fifth point is the notion of transformation. That this consciousness of God on a deeper level is transformative. It changes the person, and it enables the person to help others to be transformed as well. So that here, mysticism, again, goes back to the point I made in the beginning. It's not just personal or private or solipsistic in some way. It transforms the person, but it transforms the person so that that person can reach out to others. Mystics, not all mystics write, not all mystics teach, But the history of mysticism is only what we can learn from those who have written and from those who've taught others. And they feel that their deeper experiences of God have given them a kind of vocation, that they have to communicate the message, no matter how difficult that message is. And that message involves a new ways of coming to a deeper awareness of God that involves both the intellect and the will, involve both knowing God and loving God. Knowing God in a deeper way, because knowing the awareness that you can never really know who or what God is, or knowing God, as the mystics say, often connaturally, by a kind of connatural knowledge that you can't put in words. It's not knowing more about God, but it's knowing God in a new way. And effectively, it's a new awareness of being loved by God, being loved by God in a sense, overwhelmingly. Romans 5:5, God has poured out his love into our hearts. You might say that's the definition of the affective transformation that the mystics talk about. God has poured out his love into our hearts. We didn't gain it. It was a gift. Transformation. How do you know the transformation has existed? And I'm coming up to my last few minutes here. Well, the transformation is only known by its fruits. As the Gospel of Matthew 7:16, by their fruits you will know them. So mystics are known by what they do and the effect that they have had. Not that mystics are perfect people, they're human beings. They have their faults, they made their mistakes, they're not superhuman beings, but they did make an effect. By their fruits you will know them. And then finally, two final terms: presence. Now, why emphasize the presence of God when often the mystics talk about God's absence? Well, the whole mystical life and experience is a kind of combination, if you will, an oscillation between presence and absence, both of which are very, very important. And in that sense, experiences of God's presence often then are followed by experiences of God's absence. And the mystic learns both from the presence, both from the consciousness of presence and the consciousness of absence, more about how to appreciate the real divine nature. I have here one more quotation from great French philosopher, 20th century and mystic Simone Weil, from her notebooks. Contact with human creatures is given us through a sense of presence. Contact with God is given us through the sense of absence. Compared with this absence, presence becomes more absent than absence. Think about that. And then finally, language. The study of mysticism begins with the mystical text and its language. You know, we have no direct access to the consciousness of another person, so you can't really study, mystical consciousness. Even if you put wires on people's heads, I think you might see brainwave differences. But what does that have to tell us? Mysticism as a tradition exists in terms of language, the way human beings communicate and express to each other. And there are certain important principles about the nature of mystical language that any student of mysticism needs to keep in mind as they study the phenomenon. First of all, and most important, God is ineffable. You can't really say who God is or what God is. So the mystic can't really talk about God. God is ineffable. But the mystic feels called that they must talk about God, however inadequately. And that means that language in being used about God is always going to be stretched, transformed, subvertive. It's not going to be scientific language, denotive language. It's going to be much more like poetic language than it is like any kind of scientific language. And that kind of mystical language then, a more poetical language, will involve many kinds of verbal strategies and games, I call them mystical games, that many mystics play, similar to what other great literary artists poets and prose writers. It will involve all sorts of kinds of images, metaphors, paradoxes, rhetorical excesses, etc., etc. You have to pay attention to the language that the mystic uses. Mystical language finding will have a particular form of characteristic. That is, it has to be both positive and negative. It has to be both what the mystics, going back to Dionysius, called cataphatic, speaking positively, and apophatic, speaking negatively. That is, you say God is good. That's cataphatic. But then you have to immediately deny that and say God is not good, apophatic, because God can't be good in the way in which we understand God. And so all mystics will make use of both forms of language. You can't divide them into cataphatic mystics and apophatic mystics. They're all both. But they use cataphatic and apophatic in different registers in different ways. That's part of what makes the study of mysticism interesting. And the best and most important mystics also insist that you have to go beyond both affirmation and negation to a higher level, a level that we can't really speak about. That is, we have to go beyond both affirmation and negation to talk about God as what I call hyperphatic terms, where you explore the limits of language. God is good, God is not good, God is beyond good and not good, in a kind of realm that ends in silence, which is where many mystics do. So I could say much more, but I think that that's probably my time thus far, and I'll invite questions, observations, criticisms, attacks, whatever.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Professor McGinn. I have many notes from your very inspiring lecture. But let me start with some simple questions, and then I will give to my colleagues here to ask questions to you. And I also invite our audience in wherever you are to use the live chat on YouTube, and I will show your question on the screen. Professor McGinn, many of our audience are theologians, and they like studying theology. Do you think it is important for theologians and students in theology to study mysticism? Because for some people, mysticism is kind of vague, and they still don't know what mysticism is about. Whereas theology is a systematic, disciplined, and very scientific sort of. So do you think it is important for students of theology to study?
Oh, I think it's vital today. It was not. I'm old enough to know when it was not. 50, 60 years ago, mysticism was really on the fringes and was not considered very, very, very important. One of the most important things in theology, because of the last 50 to 80 years, you could say, has been the rediscovery of spirituality and mysticism as integral to theology. All the great theologians of the late 20th century made that point. You can point to the von Balthasars and the Bronners and the Lonergans and Procongas, and I'm talking about mostly Catholics, but even on the Protestant side, rediscovery of mysticism become vitally important, spirituality and mysticism. And many of these scholars pointed back to the unfortunate things that happened in the late Middle Ages, probably in the 14th century, 15th century, when spirituality, mysticism, and school theology, which had been together, began to separate. And they pointed that out as one of the great dangers, one of the great mistakes in the history of theology. Someone like Meister Eckhart in the 13th and 14th century Well, the great mystic and a great scholastic thinker, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, another perfect example. You know, a generation before, Thomas Aquinas, whether he was a mystic or not, certainly was very interested in mysticism. So I think in all Christian traditions today, there's a recognition that a theology without mysticism and spirituality is an arid, useless, I would have to say, enterprise.
Thank you. So let me turn to my colleagues here. Echa or Timo, the time is yours now.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. You decorate my mind, especially, and I have 2 questions for you. The first questions: are there clear borders between mystical experience and madness? How does a person know that what she or he is experiencing is a mystical experience and not narcissism or of her or himself? Because there may be other factors such as a person's subjective awareness which reflect previous experience.
Yeah.
And my second question,
Okay.
as far as I know, as far as I read your books, Master Eckhart has had a strong impression on you. I first read Eckhart's part in the volume 4 of the Presence of God series, and you even wrote a book mainly about Meister Eckhart in 2001. Why do you think Eckhart became so influential in the history of mysticism, and why Eckhart still need to be discussed until today? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the questions. They're really interesting questions. The first question is a very complicated one, because mystical experience or mystical consciousness is a very unusual kind of experience. And so its relationship to other, what we could call marginal experiences, is always hard to determine. And many mystics have been accused of having, various psychological problems or falling into psychological, what we call, psychological illnesses today. Teresa of Avila would be a very good example. Teresa, in much earlier literature in the 19th century, 20th century, was described as a kind of hysteric who had various kinds of psychological problems. And there are elements in her writings that you could see that, could lead people in that direction. But the problems, the personal problems that many mystics have had and described ordinarily lead them to a stage of integration rather than to a stage of disintegration, the way that mental illness often does. This is certainly the case with someone like Teresa. So that I think certainly one of the things described by some mystics are close to what we would define today as depression or various other kinds of psychological problems. They're part of a life story that leads in a different kind of direction. But that's not always easy to determine in particular cases. However, the tradition tried to work with that as a big theme in Christian history about the discernment of spirits, as a phrase that occurs in the New Testament, as you probably know. That is, not all people who claim very special kinds of experiences and forms of consciousness maybe are really, legitimate. Their spirit needs to be discerned. And does that spirit come from them, from within, from maybe their own illnesses? Does it come from the devil? This was the other determination in the Middle Ages. Or is it a spirit that comes from God? Now that, that's a practical case. There's no hard and fast rules for discernment of spirits. But all the mystics were very well aware of the need for discernment of spirits. You just don't take everything that somebody says and say, oh yeah, well, that's perfectly fine. So your question is a large one. There have been a lot of books written on the relationship between psychological experiences and various forms of what we would today call mental illness, especially depression, and mystics. And some mystics certainly experience things that sound much like mental illness, but often they work their way through it. And as for Meister Eckhart, I mean, I think he's one of the most important mystics in the history of the Christian tradition for many different ways. For one thing, he combines, as I said before, a very rich theological thinking with also a very powerful vernacular mysticism preached to people in of his era in medieval Germany. So he's a great example of how the best mysticism is also deeply theological and thought through, and it's not just some kind of excessive kind of emotionalism. Meister Eckhart is a theologian, he's a philosopher, he's all those things, but he's also a mystic, and you can't divide that. And so as a wonderful combination of theologian, philosopher, and mystic, I think he still holds a lot of kind of exemplary, he holds an exemplary position for people who study mysticism today. That's a short answer to a complicated question, but thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor McGinn, I have a question related to what Sheila asked, especially the first question. I'm sure that you are also aware some of your critics have posed your use of consciousness rather than experience. For them, you have been accused of being rationalistic by using that term rather than experience. So how would you comment to your critics?
Yeah, well, I mean, people may have different meanings that they put into consciousness as well as into experience. For me, consciousness is the awareness that exists on all levels of the human subject's activity. From sensation through thinking, rational thinking, through super rational thinking, through loving, deciding. In other words, it's a general term as I use it, consciousness, and I use it primarily in dependence on my own teacher, Bernard Lonergan, a great Canadian Jesuit philosopher and theologian. That I'm not thinking of consciousness in a narrow rationalistic sense. I'm thinking of it in a holistic sense that embraces all human awareness. And for me, then, that's why I prefer it to the term experience, because it includes experience. But it doesn't limit mysticism to just having some kind of new experiences. It also says that you have to think about the experiences, and then you have to decide what you're going to do about them, and they have to move you towards certain activity of love, both love of God and love of neighbor. All those are conscious activities, and that's why I prefer the term consciousness.
Timo.
Well, thank you, Professor, for your insightful lecture in this morning in Indonesia and also evening in the
I'm
States.
sorry to make you get up so early.
It's okay. So I have some questions for you. The first one is, when you mentioned that mysticism is about, how to say, transforming activity in all of our aspects. It's also about growing and process. It's not just a moment in time, but is a whole journey of life. So
Yes.
It reminds me of the word spirituality. So my question is, what's the difference between mysticism and spirituality? Is it from the word truth, spirit, and mystery, or is mysticism is deeper? How to say, a deeper understanding of spirituality, or you can tell us more about it. And then
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
the second question is, so what do you think, or what's your opinion about Jesus as a mystic. Uh, is he can we say a mystic par excellence, or a role model or a good model for us as Christian to be a true mystics, since Bible witness that uh, Jesus also experienced the presence and absence of God, and Jesus also have action and contemplative life in his life, and then and etc. So can we say that Jesus is a true mystic? Uh, and then the third one, you mentioned also about uh, deification uh, as a mystical element or mystical experience. So is this something that how to say being it's the goal of human life? Is it the how to say, is it part of the, I don't know what's the words, uh, the main goal of
Okay.
of life, yeah,
Yeah.
to be one with God, or to be with God, in communion with God. So is this something that will be fully happen, or fully in eschatology, in the future, or or something that is also uh, how to say
Present.
in life, yeah.
Yeah. No, present in life. No.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you.
they're very good questions. Relationship of spirituality and mysticism is very integral. They're both terms that go deep into the Christian tradition. The term, living in the spirit, pneumatikos, is crucial to the New Testament, both in John and especially in Paul. The term spirituality itself, first appears in the patristic period in the 4th century. And it relates to all those aspects of Christian life, I think, that deal with life in the spirit. And I would say that spirituality is a kind of very broad term that encompasses many, many aspects of Christian life, whereas mysticism is a narrower category within spirituality, is that type of spirituality which looks always for the deepest possible contact with God. So I don't see them as in any way distinct, but I would see mysticism as a kind of deep element within all spirituality, if that would be a way to describe it. And both these terms, of course, spirituality as a noun is older than mysticism, but they've always existed together, and many people use them interchangeably. And I have no great problem with that. But if people ask me, is there a difference? That's how I would express the difference. Spirituality is a general term. Mysticism is a category within spirituality, defined by its seeking the deepest possible level of contact. Jesus is the exemplary mystic in the whole Christian tradition. As you said, is Jesus? Yes, that for the Christian mystics, Jesus is the first mystic. He's the prime mystic because of his relationship with God, his Father, is absolutely essential and deeper than anyone else, as he says throughout all of the Gospels, and as he mentions, and as he prays, and as he talks in different ways about his unique relationship with his Father, his direct relationship with the Father. I mean, so Jesus is the exemplary mystic, and that's certainly the way in which he's understood in the Johannine, the Synoptics, the Johannine Gospel, and especially in Paul. So, Jesus has a unique relationship because he's Son of God in the deepest possible sense, who invites us to join him in sonship, but our sonship will always be, if you will, less than his. It's along with his. It's not on our own. It's only with and through his. So Jesus is crucial, and almost all Christian mysticism is Christological. It has to be. Otherwise, it wouldn't be Christian. The Christology of the mystics is expressed in different ways because, they're all very different kinds of figures. So they take their Christology in different kinds of directions. But there's no Christian mystic who is not a Christological mystic. And finally, your third point, which remind me now of this again because I got worked up in my, which was about deification, divinization. There are different ways of expressing the goal of the mystical path. Mystical union is very, very common, but I don't use that as the defining characteristic because some mystics don't talk about union. Augustine of Hippo would be a good example because he thought union with God was a kind of pagan Neoplatonic category. So he talked about attaining God or seeing God. So union, along with deification, along with the vision of God, along with pure prayer, along with a whole range of other terms, these are some of the different ways in which mystics talk about coming deeper and deeper into contact with God. And deification, I think, is a very central one because the whole meaning of the gospel, expressed particularly in the Johannine prologue, God became man so that man could become God. That's deification. The term itself doesn't occur in the New Testament, but many other scriptural passages were cited for deification. And the economy of the incarnation is deifying. Now, all mystics also insist that deification is never complete in this life, nor is union ever complete in this life. So it's all, again, part of a process that aims towards the eschaton, that aims towards the heavenly situation, where union and deification and all these terms will be perfect. But all the mystics insist there's always a distinction between what's possible in this life and what's going to come in the next life. And so while divinization, deification exists here below, it's never perfect. While union here may exist and sometimes be a kind of foretaste of what will come in heaven, it's never going to be the same in heaven. It won't be permanent. It won't be as deep. It won't be as realized. So that's another part of the process aspect of the history of Christian mysticism. It's a process that we're on that's can't end here below. Can only end in the goal. So you could say that all mysticism is eschatological, which I think is certainly true. So is that, and one final point on divinization, deification, I mean, they can be interchangeable. Many Christians think that deification is a matter only of Orthodox Christianity, and it's very, very important. The whole Eastern Orthodox tradition is centered on the notion of deification, quite rightfully so, because it's so scriptural. But the idea that it's Eastern Christian and not Western Christian is another big mistake. Almost all the important Western Christian authors also talk about divinization and deification and have, different ways of getting at it. So it's not a way of dividing Orthodox Christianity from Western Christianity, Catholic or Protestant. Luther himself talked about deification and divinization, as we know from recent Luther scholarship. So it's an integral part of Christianity. And one of the glories of Orthodox theology has been to put it as in so central a place. And that's a great thing.
Professor McGinn, you mentioned that Augustine did not teach divinization or...
he doesn't talk about union. He does talk about divinization in some of his sermons.
Oh, I see. Oh, yes. But how would you comment on the work of Father David McConney, who worked from St. Louis University, who says that Augustine also talked union with God or some sort of deification or divinization.
Well, he certainly uses the term divinization, deification, but it's interesting if you read the Confessions, for example, of Augustine, you see that he has a vision of the divine light in different places. This is book 7, for example, particularly book 7 and 10, where he sees the divine light and he gradually ascends there. And if you read the famous Ostia experience at the end of book 9, he doesn't talk about being united with God. He talks about an ascent to God and coming to just touch the divine realm and to be inspired and changed both in his mind and in his, in his love and his affective person by that. And for him, union with God, when he uses union with God, as I read him, he mostly talks about our union with Christ in the church. But he doesn't go on at great length about how we're united with God, the way, say, Teresa of Avila does, or Meister Eckhart does, or John of the Cross does, or any number of mystics we can. I've often thought this is the case because Augustine was very well versed in Plotinus, the great Neoplatonic mystic, and he knew Plotinus's Enneads well. And for Plotinus, union with the One, the highest principle of all, is the key aim for the soul's ascent. And I think Augustine kind of avoided that because he thought that kind of language, union, henosis is the Greek term that Plotinus used, was more of a pagan category. So he used these biblical categories of seeing God, of touching God, even of tasting God, as his way to describe the. So if you're going to, if union is the fundamental category of Christian mysticism, Augustine's on the margins. But if you take a wider view of mysticism as ways of finding the presence of God and then describing that inadequately in our language, then Augustine, as he should be, is right at the heart of Catholic mysticism. And of course, he influenced all the later tradition, mostly in the West, but also in the East, because there were many Eastern Orthodox Christians who read their Augustine. So that's how I would answer that.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of comments from our audience. Let me show you. Vivi Chandra, she thanked you of your presentation, and she pointed out the importance of the use of apophatic and cataphatic language in mysticism. And she also asked the question with Timo, so we will skip this. And there is a question from Febrianto. Mysticism is found and expressed in many religions. What are the common and also distinctive elements between mysticism found in other religions and Christian mysticism?
Okay, to answer that question would take at least another 3 lectures. Because there are certainly common elements in the mystical traditions. And I spent many years studying some other traditions, not perfectly. I know a fair amount about Jewish mysticism, a little bit less about Islamic mysticism, but I've studied them. I've never really studied Buddhist mysticism very well or other traditions. Life is just too short. And what I've learned, of course, is that there are very interesting interchanges and parallels and communications between the different traditions. And I've had the opportunity to teach courses with colleagues in Jewish mysticism and Islamic mysticism, from which I've learned a tremendous amount. But to try to summarize that would be extremely difficult. I do think the comparative study of mysticism is absolutely vital today. And to anyone who's interested in Christian mysticism, I would say you have to also learn something about another tradition. You may not become a master of it because you may not know the languages all that well, but you have to study as intensely as you can some other tradition to kind of get a better sense of your own mystical tradition. by comparing and seeing the differences and asking why this may be the same or sounds the same, but it's really different, or asking why, this is very different, where does it come from, etc. So the comparative study of mysticism is a crucial element in today's world of the recovery of mysticism in our ecumenical age. And out of that, we'll be able to make better judgments about where the traditions may be the same and where they may differ. There's much earlier work done on this in the past century and a half, but frankly, a lot of it is pretty superficial. Whereas today, I think we have to plunge deeper, try to compare traditions from their own perspectives, and not just from a Christian perspective or just from an Islamic perspective or whatever. That's the work to be done in the generation to come and the generations to come, not just one.
Very interesting. Thank you. Sheila and Timo, do you still have questions to Professor McGinn? I do.
Okay.
Well, Professor McGinn, many religious people and also theologians are very nervous about orthodoxy and heresy. And so, as we also come across that many mystics throughout the history of Western Christianity have been accused of being heretics and teaching heresy, and many of them were burned at the stake. So, is it still important for today to deal with orthodoxy and heresy, according to your view?
Well, I think they're part of the tradition in mysticism. That is, there have always been tensions between orthodoxy and some forms of mysticism. That's very much a part of the Christian tradition, because Christianity is a religion that stresses orthodoxy, correct belief, as against those other traditions that stress orthopraxy, correct practice, where you might be able to believe anything you want as long as you practice what the community practices. So as part of the evolution of Christianity, and right from the Gnostics in the 2nd century through the Thessalians in the 4th century, down to the late Middle Ages, and down to the condemnation of Quietism in the 17th century, which I was working on Quietist mystics. There have been tensions between mystics and the Orthodox. Some of them are misunderstandings. Some of them are exaggerations on the part of some mystics. That's certainly true. Others of them are come from the side of the Orthodox in a kind of rigidification of their view of the essence of religion. So they're part of our history. We have to learn and study them. I'm not sure, and that's something that has to be done. A better understanding of these tensions between mysticism and orthodoxy, I think, is part of where we are at the present time. And one of the things that might teach us is to be much more careful about making accusations of heresy. It's a category most Catholic theologians don't really use today very, very much, and I think that's very, very good. But we still have to make decisions. We still have to make judgments about certain kinds of teaching that that fit with the tradition, other kinds of teaching that maybe push the tradition too far. But we'll learn more about it as we learn more about the history. But today, I mean, keep it in mind, keep the history in mind, and the history will mostly teach you that you have to be very careful about making accusations, because often they may be proven to be wrong. There may be people who are talking past each other and didn't understand each other. So it's there.
Wow, this is very fascinating. Well, if Sheila and Timo, you don't have more questions to Professor McGinn, let me close with one more question, Professor McGinn. In times like this, where we cannot meet one another, when pandemic is a global reality, if you are to pick three mystics, uh, who would you suggest us to study, especially for our times?
Well, there are many. When I have talked to mysticism about to Catholic groups, parishes, and other groups like that, I often get asked this question: "No, who should I read?" I think I might start with Julian of Norwich, the 14th century English female mystic, who was very, very popular. She was forgotten for centuries, but she's been very, very popular for the last 150 years. One reason I would start with her is her works, her two showings. They're very accessible to a general reader. They really catch most general readers well. I mean, she's very deep theologically, but she wasn't trained in the school, so it's not a technical kind of theology. But I think a lot of people really get a lot out of reading Julian of Norwich. She's a very important mystic, very deep mystic theologically, but she has a message and a way of writing that people will relate to. I'd also, I would certainly say Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart's sermons. Meister Eckhart's technical Latin works are very difficult. They're written in scholastic Latin. I've translated a fair number of them, others have, and they're very important for the kind of theological basis of his mysticism. But the ordinary reader will probably not get much out of the technical Latin works, but they will get some. I think they'll get a lot out of the sermons. The sermons are difficult. You often are not quite sure what is he getting at, but so many people get attracted to these sermons and find his particular way of preaching, particularly preaching mystical traditions, very captivating. Even though it's always work to read an Eckhart sermon, you never go and say, oh well, just can read page after page. You have to stop and think and say, well, what is he really trying to get at there? My third choice, I would say, well, there's lots of people who could be chosen, but I think I'm going to choose another woman, and I would suggest Catherine of Siena, another 14th century figure, a lay woman who writes. It's a long text, Catherine's dialogue with God. But again, it's a very accessible text. You don't want to sit down to read the whole thing because it's extremely long. But if you read sections in it, she's a very direct relationship to God and a very kind of unique way of speaking to him and speaking to her and giving her a message that is again meant for a very general audience, which is very, very important. So that's the three that I would say come to mind immediately. I mean, obviously there are many other kinds of figures, and as with literature, people will come along and be very pleased with one or another author, and then they'll say, "Oh, that author just doesn't reach me, just doesn't capture me." So, if one or other of these, doesn't capture you, try to read others, because there's a personal aspect to reading mystics, the way there is a personal aspect to reading great literature. Some figures will, oh yeah, I really love so and so. I know so and so is famous, but I don't really care for that very much. But those are figures I'd mention offhand.
Well, with this, I think this is the perfect way to finish our session. So let me thank again to Professor Bernard McGinn, who has kindly blessed us and shared us his scholarship. And thank you so much again, Professor McGinn. And we are very pleased to have you on our session today.
Okay, well, thank you all for your part in setting this up and for an interesting discussion, and for all those listening in. I would say I'm very happy to make your acquaintance, and I hope we'll meet again when times are better.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much. Okay. Goodbye, friends. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you, Timo, for
Thank you.
joining us.